Today we're going to look at the different types of water pollution and how that water pollution can be managed. The first type that we've talked about before are the oxygen-demanding waste. So this is that organic material that has to be broken down, and that decomposition by aerobic bacteria takes the dissolved oxygen out of the water. So that could be human sources like sewage, animal feedlots, or as you can see in this picture, the pulp from paper mills. So when the decomposers use up the oxygen, the dissolved oxygen levels in the water drop, and that can cause the death of the native aquatic organisms. So biological demand, just a reminder, is the term that means the amount of dissolved oxygen that the decomposers need to break down the organic matter. So if you have a high biological oxygen demand, you're going to have a low amount of dissolved oxygen. Remember that oxygen sag curve that we looked at in the previous module. Our second type of water pollution are infectious agents. Those are the waterborne illnesses like bacteria, viruses, protozoa, parasitic worms. Most of the human sources are once again from sewage or animal waste. Some of those waterborne diseases, typhoid fever, cholera, dysentery, giardiasis, hepatitis, to name a few. One of the ways that we can tell if we have good water quality is by determining the number of colonies of coliform bacteria. Coliform bacteria is a type of bacteria that shows up in sewage and animal waste. And if those are present, then you're going to run the risk of these types of diseases. So the World Health Organization and EPA recommend that your drinking water have 0 colonies per 100 milliliters, and that's in drinking water. Swimming pools can have higher amounts, but usually they don't because the amount of chlorine in a swimming pool is much higher than that in drinking water. But you combine all of the bodies and you are going to have a little bit higher bacteria levels, and it is acceptable, but not a good idea to drink swimming pool water. All right, our third type are the inorganic chemicals. This is the stuff that is non-living. So acids, heavy metals, salts, things like that are found in the water. A lot of this comes from surface runoff from our roads or industrial areas, household cleansers. These are the types of things that can harm the human body. So it might lead to cancer. It can also harm aquatic life. If it is used as irrigation water and pumped on the fields, it can lower the crop yields. We saw that with salinization. Can cause corrosion, make the water non-potable or non-potable, which means non-drinkable. To determine the types of inorganic chemicals in the water, we can use chemical water analysis, and most water treatment plants are going to do this before they send out water as drinking water. Organic chemicals, gasoline, oil, plastics, which are a petroleum product, pesticides, detergents. Once again, human sources, a lot of that comes from industrial runoff, household cleansers, and farms. These too can threaten human and wildlife. They're detected by chemical water analysis. Also, we can look at the presence or absence of certain indicator species to determine some of the organic chemicals that are in the water. For example, filter feeders, like our mollusks, they get their nutrients from the water. So if there are some of these chemical pollutants, then we're not going to see healthy filter feeders. Our next type of water pollution is sediment, which can lead to high turbidity. If you have soil and silt, remember silt and clay are smaller size sediments, so they can be suspended in the water. So a lot of this comes from land erosion. When we remove vegetation, that increases erosion into our bodies of water. When we have too much sediment and have high turbidity, that can reduce photosynthesis because sunlight cannot penetrate to those bottom plants. So if we don't have our primary producers, that's going to affect the aquatic food webs. It's going to affect our benthic species, those that live on the bottom. It can clog harbors, clog lakes. That sediment builds up behind dams. Another type of water pollution is thermal pollution or heat. Whenever you have excessive heat in the body of water, that's going to affect any of the aquatic organisms there. So a lot of times this heat comes from the cooling water from power plants. The water that's used to cool the equipment is then dumped back into the lake or body of water that it came from. So when you have warmer water, you're going to have more evaporation. So that means your oxygen is evaporating, and that can lower dissolved oxygen and causes thermal shock, which you can see has happened in that picture there to the right. All right, we're going to look at the Ganges River in India and what has happened in terms of water pollution there. It is a holy river. More than 1 million people bathe in this river, so it's not very sanitary. They also have a religious belief that when they die, they are cremated and they throw the ashes back into the river because it is a holy river. Those that cannot afford to burn their bodies or have them cremated will often throw whole bodies in the river, and so there will just be decomposing bodies floating down the Ganges. So what they're trying to do to take care of some of this, they've built waste treatment plants so that raw sewage is not dumped into the river. And they have also added snapping turtles. They found that the snapping turtles will eat the dead bodies, and so this has helped tremendously with that problem. All right, freshwater lakes are going to be more vulnerable to pollution. They're small, they're not running water, so the water is sitting there, so a lot of the waste cannot be processed. They're often stratified, which means they're layered. So we don't see much mixing, though some lakes have seasonal mixing. Very little flow. So one of the problems with our lakes is biomagnification. So if you input some type of pesticide or chemical, remember that if all species are exposed to that, all of them are going to have a small concentration. Well, if a larger or a predator eats its prey, it's going to pick up its own concentration plus whatever was in its prey. And so by the time you get to the top of the food chain, what we were seeing with DDT is a lot of the birds of prey that ate the seafood, we were seeing there were high concentrations of DDT in their bodies. PCBs are another example of pollutant that bioaccumulates, therefore biomagnifies. And even though they've been banned since 1976, we still find many tons of PCBs mixed into the silt in the bottoms of lakes because it's not mixed. They're not flowing, so that does not get dispersed. And then we've talked about eutrophication many times. Whenever you add nutrients to the water, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, or nitrates and phosphates, that's going to lead to excessive algae growth. Cultural eutrophication, remember anytime you hear the word cultural or anthropogenic, it means having to do with humans. So cultural eutrophication is eutrophication or nutrient enrichment caused by humans. So a lot of times that comes from runoff of fertilizers, runoff of animal manure from feedlots, sewage treatment plants pumping waste into the water, even erosion of topsoil can do that as well. So what happens in addition to the algae growth is nitrates can also bind to the hemoglobin, which is what transports the oxygen in the blood. And this affects a lot of the amphibians in these bodies of water. The algae blooms, which are going to decrease the amount of sunlight that penetrates the water. You're going to have more decomposers at work on the algae, so that's going to decrease your dissolved oxygen levels because your biological oxygen demand has risen. And this also disrupts the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles as well. All right, so looking at this diagram, here at the top we have what is called an oligotrophic lake, and remember that is one that has that clear water, light can penetrate to the bottom, and then as you start adding nutrients, that's when you see that algae growth on the surface, more turbidity in the water. At first you're going to have a lot of nutrients and animals are going to survive and thrive, but then eventually as the algae dies and decomposes, that's when those dissolved oxygen levels drop, and then we get to our eutrophic lake. And so notice the bottom, we've got a lot of detritus, dead algae, sediments that pile up. So it actually makes the lake or pond more shallow over time from eutrophication. So some of the things that we can do to prevent or control that If we plant vegetation along the side of the stream or the lake or the pond, what that does is prevent some of those sediments from running off into that body of water. If we control our runoff, especially from our feedlots, like our hog farms in eastern North Carolina, so those nitrates and phosphates don't get into the wetlands and into the larger bodies of water. Anything that we're adding fertilizer to, golf courses, agricultural fields. If we use biological control, we have certain type of denitrifying bacteria that we can introduce to help clear away some of the algae and some of the nutrients. When we look at wastewater treatment, there are several stages. Advanced treatment is only used in certain cases, and that removes nitrates and phosphates before we put that water back into a stream system. Banning phosphates in household cleaners. A lot of dish detergent, laundry detergent has phosphates. So if you buy something that has an eco label or green label, a lot of times if you look at the ingredients, it does not contain those phosphates. If we remove the weeds or plants using herbicides or other methods, that can also help slow eutrophication as well. And then to make up for the low levels of dissolved oxygen, pumping in oxygen. Similar to the bubbles in a fish tank that add dissolved oxygen, they're basically doing that on a large scale. So this will be an oxygen tank, and they just have a pipe running into the water, and it's basically just looks like it's pumping in air bubbles. As far as groundwater pollution, usually that's when something underground starts to leak. Like in this picture, you see there's some type of underground storage, liquid storage that leaks, and it's above the water table, so it seeps down into that aquifer. Groundwater flows. It flows downhill just like surface water, and so that pollutant's going to flow as well. And so if it gets where a well is, and that pollutant's going to be drawn up into that well. It's very slow and it's hard to control, so a lot of times if there's a pollutant in groundwater, there's not really much you can do to clean it up. It's just kind of a waiting game. So the first thing you would need to do is to control the spill itself and then just monitor the drinking water. It can't cleanse itself like surface water can because it's moving so slowly. There's not as much bacteria to take care of some of the waste. And also it takes a lot of time to recharge groundwater. Rainwater has to seep down through the ground. It's impossible to clean it up, so really the only way to protect groundwater is to prevent spills from happening. So it's important that if we do have those underground storage tanks, that we have ways to monitor to make sure they aren't leaking, so that when a leak does occur, we can catch it before it does any damage. We also store hazardous waste above ground or find other ways. Deep injection wells, so it's below the aquifer so that it does not get into our drinking water. And then we talked in class about fracking and how we take that water chemical mix, pump it into the ground, causing the fractures, so that gas, those chemicals can get into the groundwater and cause problems. As far as ocean pollution, we don't know how much pollution the ocean can tolerate. Because it does break down waste, and we take that for granted, and a lot of times we pump that waste into the ocean, deep ocean, instead of trying to bury it on land. You can see from this diagram some of the runoff into the ocean from the land. So a lot of our coastal areas and wetlands are seeing problems with a lot of these sediments, of these nutrients that are making it to the estuaries and wetlands. And part of that's because the majority, or not the majority, but 40% of the world's population lives very close to the coastline, within 160 miles. And 14 of our 15 largest metropolitan cities worldwide are on the coast. If untreated sewage is dumped directly into the ocean, that can lead to algae blooms, which are also called red tides. You can see this particular type of algae is red in color. And just like eutrophication in freshwater, we see the lowered levels of dissolved oxygen. Certain types of algae also release toxins that can poison seafood. Some of the solutions, because oceans are international, they have to be international agreements. One of the first ones was the Helsinki Convention, and that was the countries around the Baltic Sea. Other solutions, U.S. has banned dumping off of coasts. There are places worldwide they can, you just can't do it off of the U.S. coast. And 50 other countries have agreed to stop dumping as well. it is hard to enforce.